Welcome, everyone. I'm Val Hawkins, Chair of Agenda Alexandria. In our 24th season, Agenda Alexandria is our community's premier organization that explores the issues that our city faces without taking sides. In fact, our motto is taking a look without taking sides. Today, we have a very special program of high interest to our community, advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in Alexandria. A conversation on what it will take to advance a new dialogue and a new action on race, equity, and inclusion. Special thanks to our program sponsors for the year, Simpson Development, Homes of Alexandria Compass, the Zebra newspaper, and our sustaining contributors, Eileen Ahern, Ricardo Alfaro, Linda and Steve App, Russell Bailey, Dave Baker, Janet Barnett of Synergy Home Care, Christopher and Brooke Curran, Oscar and Toby Fitzgerald, Jenny Franco, Jay Hoffman, Hoffheimer Security and Telephone Systems, Lee Carosi Dunn, Liz Legg, Kit Leiter, Ann Leiter, Pat Miller, David Speck, Julianne, and Shad Thomas. We would like to thank our board members who have worked very hard to organize and execute our program today. Aaliyah Gaskins, who's our committee leader and moderator for the day, and Shad Thomas, who's a co-leader. And thanks to Ricardo Alfaro, our vice chair and producer. And finally, we're most appreciative of our great panelists who have graciously given their time and thought to address this important subject. Aaliyah will introduce them after this message.
Hi, good evening. My name is Aaliyah Gaskins, and I serve on the board of Agenda Alexandria. It's my distinct honor to serve as the moderator for tonight's discussion, advancing a new conversation on race, equity, and inclusion. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person out there who, when it's time to have a conversation about race, you've heard that it's going to be difficult, or it's going to be uncomfortable, or it's going to be frustrating. I mean, I've heard from friends of mine who are white who have said, I fear going to these conversations because I don't want to be attacked and I don't want to be called a racist. As a Black woman, I'll be honest, sometimes I don't like having these conversations. I don't like being put in a space where if I share my story, I feel as though I'm going to be attacked or have my story pulled apart because somebody feels it's not true because it hasn't happened to them. There are times when we've all been in the room getting ready to sit down and have a dialogue about race and equity, and it feels as though we're actually talking past each other instead of listening and engaging. We've all been there, but what I hope we can convey tonight is that no matter how it makes you feel, no matter how uncomfortable it gets, we have to talk. We have to talk about it because race impacts our decisions, whether consciously or unconsciously. We have to talk about it because race shapes our institutions and the works that they do. We have to talk about it because, let's be honest, everybody else is talking about it. If you look at our national discourse, whether we, are coming out of the summer and we're talking about the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, or we're talking about the recent insurrection at the Capitol, or even the fact that you turn on a sports game and NBA players have Black Lives Matter on their jersey. It's something we're all talking about and trying to figure out. And Agenda Alexandria is a place where we come together to discuss the issues without taking sides. It's where we come together to get informed so that we can make a decision and become better engaged in the issues that affect our community. And so we're going to talk. This is more than about defining words and giving you a bunch of definitions. Our hope is that it's really a conversation that illustrates different examples and gives us a working vocabulary that we can use as we carry forward into other conversations. We're going to talk about the things we don't really understand, but that we want to. We're going to talk about where we've been, where we are, and where we hope to go. And so I'm excited to be joined by three dynamic and amazing women for this panel. We have Bernadette Onyanaka, who is the principal and co-founder of ONG Racial Equity Collaborative. We have Sarah Vandergroot, who is a nationally certified massage therapist and registered yoga teacher. She's also the co-owner of Mind the Mat Studio. And then we have Jacqueline Tucker, who is the city's first race and social equity officer. I'm not going to read you full bios. Instead, what I want to do is make time and space for you to get to know a little bit more about who they are and the perspective they bring. The reality is their story is their story. My story is my story, and your story is yours. Each of us comes to this with a different history and a different perspective. And I think the only way that we can actually engage in a dialogue is to humanize each other first and get to know who we are as people and the experiences we've had. And so, Bernadette, I'm going to start with you. I'd love for you to tell our audience, who are you, whose are you, and where are you from?
Thank you, Aaliyah. I'm really excited and glad to be here. So who am I? I am Bernadette Ndidi Uchechi Onyanaka. I am a Nigerian American, not an immigrant, not even second generation, but really sort of New Jersey born and bred with Nigerian roots and blood that flows through my veins and that connects me to the land of our ancestors, which I find and have always found a lot of peace and solace in knowing that so many Black people do not have that privilege of knowing where they come from. So that's who I am. I'm a daughter of a single mother who never worked less than 2 jobs my entire life. I am a sister. I am a creator. I'm a business owner. I'm many things, and I'm not many things. But I'm also a Black woman who lives in this country, and who is incredibly frustrated more often than not with where we are and where we aren't in this nation. Whose am I? I'm my mother's, Linda. I'm my sisters, Adichie and Amanda Joy. I am my friends. I am the girls. I am Kona, my small dog who legitimately claims ownership of me at any opportunity he gets. And I am mine more than anything. I deeply claim who I am and claim that ownership for myself. And where I'm from, Camden, New Jersey. It's a place that I, at one point, came to be ashamed of sharing that factoid about myself because it was so often met with the question of, have you ever seen someone get shot? And yes. So for a long time, I just told people I'm from New Jersey, but I've gotten back to a place where I am very proud to say I'm from Camden. And it's a place that, and particularly in my experience, I grew up half a block away from a different neighborhood, and a better school system, a different tax bracket. Just half a block away. And so I understand and always understood that there was a dividing line between them and us, and that it was entirely imaginary and that it could have been redesigned for things to be different. So that's who I am, whose I am, and where I'm from.
Thank you. I am so glad to have you here with us tonight. Sarah, I want to go to you next. Same question. Who are you, whose are you, and where are you from?
Thank you. I'm Sarah Vandergoot. I will start with where I'm from. I was born in Toronto. I was raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I've spent 20 years living in Delray, Alexandria. So, whose am I has been a really interesting question for me to delve into as I think about race. I was raised in a largely ethnic community, Dutch in Michigan. My entire family and my neighborhood mostly were Dutch. My father and all my grandparents were born in the Netherlands. So I saw myself as ethnic in this country, and I didn't always identify with sort of mainstream America. The other piece is that I was spent my formative years being schooled in an inner city Christian school where I was a minority. There were children of all different races, but a very large African American community there. And so where I feel at home are in places where there is diversity of people, where ethnicity is acknowledged. And I also feel a deep and rooted belonging here in Alexandria. I've been a wellness practitioner and business person here for 20 years. And this is really my home now. And I care a lot about the future of Alexandria and So that's kind of who I am and whose I am.
Thank you, Sarah. Glad to have you here.
Yeah.
Jacqueline, last but not least, same questions. Who are you? Whose are you? And where are you from?
I just have to do an aside. I'm also from Grand Rapids, Sarah. We did not make that connection prior to. Yeah, I'm actually here now. Yeah, so who am I? Jacqueline Tucker. And I'm very much so a product of my own privileges, but also my past, and the past being that of my ancestors, right? My father's family migrated from Mississippi during the Great Migration, which is the largest migration of African Americans from the Jim Crow South to the Midwest, of where I grew up in Grand Rapids, because my grandmother was told that her son was going to be lynched. So very much so fleeing that violence and oppression of the South. My mother's family, she had a large family of 10, migrated from Arkansas during the 1960s because her father was allowed to work in the General Motors plant, so earning a middle class and living wage. So those, my past, the history of my ancestors and my grandparents allowed my parents to have the privileges of going to school and being educated and receiving advanced degrees. So the privilege of growing up middle class, although I still face many obstacles as a Black woman, is very much so who I am. So that privilege and that past, that's who I am. Whose I am, I'm my ancestors and I'm my descendants. I do this work not only for myself and not only for people who look like me, but also for young people who are coming up in this world that we all been lent and have the opportunity to become better stewards of. So that is whose I am, my ancestors and my descendants. Who I am is a product of my privileges in my past and a native of Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Well, I appreciate the three of you giving us this time on a Monday evening and really looking forward to learning more about your story as we wrestle with some of the questions tonight. I would just say to anyone out there who's listening, go ahead and add your questions and comments as we go. I'll try and work them into the conversation. We'll also leave some time for, formal question and answer at the end. But Jacqueline, I want to start with you. Before we dive into any other question, lots of people are talking about race, equity, inclusion, diversity, you name it. And to be honest, anytime I look at a panel in the city, often you are called to be a part of that discussion. And so I want to start with you. Why is a new conversation needed? What needs to be different about the conversation we're getting ready to have tonight?
Mm-hmm. I think what needs to be different is that we need to approach this from multiple levels. Oftentimes we think of race and racism as individual actors who are bigots or who have individual prejudice towards individuals or different people who are different than them. And really the conversation is a lot larger than that. We're talking about systems and institutions. We're talking about governmental institutions. We're talking about transportation. We're talking about healthcare. It's so much more than an individual actor. It's really all of our systems and institutions have this white dominant culture built into them by virtue of historically who has had access and power in those same institutions and who has created those institutions really by leaving entire groups and populations out. Not only Black, Indigenous people of color have been left out of this conversation and participation, but also women. Also people who don't identify as cisgender. So there are those people who are disabled, right? Disabled persons. There are entire groups of people who have been marginalized systemically and historically. And so that is why we need to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's about so much more than the individual actor, but it's about our systems and institutions that have this culture built into them.
Well, I hope that you guys will all hold me accountable. If there's a level we need to go deeper or up, or if there's something that we really need to wrestle with tonight, please stop me or interject, because I want to make sure that we are hitting on those conversations and that it doesn't become, I think you're right. Often this becomes a blame game, or people fear that that's what's going to happen. And let's get deeper than that and really talk about some of the roots of these issues. So with that, I think let's start with just making sure from the very beginning that we are speaking the same language. I think there's a lot of terms out there, and sometimes we think we know what we mean, but let's be clear, we don't always know what we mean, or we're not always all saying the same thing. And so I'm hoping that this isn't just, rapid fire of definitions, but that really you will each use, stories and examples to kind of illustrate the concept, and help us get like a foundational understanding so we could get into some deeper questions about how these issues show up in our city. So Bernadette, I'm going to start with you. What is race? And maybe what's the difference between race, racism, and racist?
Sure. So what is race? Very simply, race is a social construct that is defined entirely by our phenotypical differences. And by phenotype, I mean what we look like. So the difference between Sarah and I, the difference in our color of skin, the difference in our texture and hair, that's literally our physical features. These are the things that we use to differentiate race as a society, as a United States society, and as a global society. But if you looked at the DNA between me and Sarah, we'd be more similar than we would be different. And so race is quite literally a social construct. There is no DNA that will tell. While you can tell that I'm a Black person from my DNA because of the amount of melanin in my DNA code, it doesn't make me any genetically different from anyone else who has less melanin. And so race is quite literally a social construct to which we as human beings have ascribed social value. And so we treat people differently based upon race, this category that was essentially invented during slavery, essentially in the 1600s in Virginia. They needed a way to ensure that the slaves wouldn't revolt. And the first slave revolt wasn't just filled with just slaves. It was poor white people who were indentured servants as well. They all realized that they were toiling in the fields and not getting any money or not getting enough money. And so they united across these racial lines and went down to the master's house and set everything ablaze and destroyed this colony. And so in order to prevent that from happening, divide and conquer was it's the oldest game in the book, and it works. They gave social privileges to people who were white, and they made slavery a chattel slavery, which means you inherited it by birth. And you were easily identifiable as Black people. And that's literally how we started creating race in this country. And so it is literally the social construct of which our entire society is built upon, including written in our Constitution, all men are created equal, and the 3/5 compromise, except for those 3/5 of slaves that we're not going to count as full human beings, because then it would give too much power to the southern states. So that's what race is. It's a social construct that we've made up and that have continued to ascribe value to socially. And that's why we see race social outcomes always look differently across the lines of race. What is racism? Racism is a system of oppression based upon race. So we made up race so then we could oppress people. That's quite literally it. And a racist, I guess, in the way that most people understand it, is a person who buys into this ideology that people of color, people who are not white, are inferior to white people, and then act upon the belief in one way or another. And it can be really innocuous and really small, from like microaggression to macroaggressions, and the ways in which we have seen our country's history: lynching, slavery, mass incarceration, racial profiling, so on and so forth. And so a racist, and the way that we often understand it, is people who engage in those behaviors. But like I said, it can range from incredibly small. So the microaggressions that often white people are very afraid of coming out of their mouths because they don't understand why it is a microaggression, reflects this internalized ideology of I am somehow superior, or I have the power or the access or the privilege or the ability to ask maybe a Black person if I can touch their hair, as if there's some sort of sideshow. That's what it implies. Hope that answered your question.
Oh, it answered my question. I mean, I think what's important there is that it is, and I hope that people take away, it's possible to talk about race and to talk about racism without talking about somebody being a racist. And that's not something that's implied by having a discussion. I do want to pick up on something you said, and Sarah, I'm going to go to you next, but Bernadette in her comments talked about kind of the privileges or the values that we assign to different people in our society. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about privilege. What does the word privilege mean when we talk about it in the context of these conversations?
Sure. Yeah, so my understanding of privilege is sort of an unearned access to resources, to influencing how a society the values of a society, that's based on, and then specifically white privilege would be those that unearned privilege is given to you because you have white skin. And so often those who have privilege, what's embedded in privilege is it's often unseen by those who have it. Those who see it are those who don't have it often. And that's my understanding of privilege.
I appreciate you sharing. And as we got ready for this panel, some folks had already started to submit comments and questions in advance. And one of the comments we received was someone shared that, as a white person, they feel attacked when language like privilege comes into the conversation. And I know that you, I'm curious, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, but you've been on your own racial equity journey and trying to understand, what these terms mean, but also your role as an ally and how you show up in community. I'm curious if you ever wrestled with some of that, or like as you began to understand your own privileges, could you talk to us a little bit about what that was like and what you, how you navigate that in conversations now?
Yes, thank you so much for asking that. Definitely the process for me has been evolutionary. I think that it's very natural to feel kind of off-put or offended when someone says, you have privilege. I think that that's natural emotional reaction. And I've had that reaction in the past. What I've come to recognize is that it's important for us to take full ownership and responsibility for our own emotional reactions because they're subjective, right? And so when we're entering in a conversation, we've got to look at things from a historical perspective and a more objective perspective and take full responsibility for our own personal emotions, right? Because they don't carry the truth, right? The truth is something that is more objective, historical, input from everybody who's involved in society, then we get closer to the truth. So when I recognized that I had to take full ownership, that those emotions and that response weren't anybody else's to solve or care for, that was a big step in my evolution on this journey. And I also would say now I see my white privilege as my responsibility in terms of being active in kind of the, sort of making our society a more equitable place to live in. I see my white privilege as a deep personal responsibility. And my willingness to, the other reason it can be off-putting for people is that I have to be willing to lose that white privilege in the name of something bigger. And that is threatening for many people, understandably, right? It takes a very deep internal journey to come to terms with giving up that privilege. And you have to really dig into, like, what are your deeper values that you believe in above this sort of this privilege. Yeah.
No, I think you raised a really good point. And I'm sure everyone has been in a conversation where you can feel your blood boiling. You can feel like you're about to say something and you're processing 1,000 emotions at once. And how do you own your emotion, especially in a conversation that sometimes we feel like I don't even know what to say in the first place. And so I'd love for us to continue talking about that as we go. Jacqueline, I want to turn to you because one of the things Sarah said is she sees herself responsible for contributing to a more equitable community. Well, I'd love for you to just kind of break down for us, what is equity? Like, what do we mean by that term? And how is that different from diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so equity simply means that everybody is getting what they need in order to belong and thrive and fully participate in our society. It's a lot different from equality, which simply means that we want people to have access to something. It's not enough, given our history and our past, given our history of policies and practices again, across all institutions for people to just have access to something. We need to have equity and make sure that the outcomes and the experiences that individuals are having are allowing them to fully thrive. Diversity just simply means that there is variety. There's a different number or amount of differing ideas, backgrounds, ethnicities, races, different types of people. So it's just the sheer quantity. Inclusion is about quality. So the quality of participation. Do you have a diverse set of individuals or people? Inclusion is, do they have power? Do they have access to power? Or are they just tokenized? Are they the only one and we have to call on them all the time? Or are they just one of the few for the sake of us being diverse? Do they have proximity to power? Do they have actual power? And are they actually being asked to bring their full selves and fully participate in whatever decision-making opportunities that exist in whatever space it is? That's inclusion. So it's not just about having people there, it's about are we asking them to show up as their full selves? And then again, equity is that sense of justice. Are the policies and the practices, the programs, the decisions, the money, does that reflect the outcomes that need to happen in order for us to achieve, parity across the board? And historically, we do not have parity. We can look at any indicator of life, whether it be healthcare, income, median income, housing, rental status, educational attainment in Alexandria, and see across the board, Black, Indigenous people of color are doing much worse off. So it's not just an idea or a concept. And again, as Bernadette said, it's not of any fault of their own. It's really the policies and procedures that have existed and continue to exist for hundreds of years that have left entire groups of people out of the conversation and out of full participation.
So you started to get at structures. I heard you say structures several times. And a lot of times, I think people are reading about it, but don't always understand my next term. But what is structural racism? And could you maybe use an example that illustrates it?
Yes. So a structure or institution. So we'll say education is a structure or institution. We'll say healthcare is a structure or institution. We'll say transportation is a structure or institution. We'll say our culture and our arts are a structure and institution. And we'll say our built environment is a structure and institution. All of those structures and institutions have their own policies and their own procedures, right? Their own ways of operating, right? They have a history that come along with them as well. All of them have white dominant culture built into them by virtue of who has created those systems and institutions, the structures. And if we close our fist, right, we have an entire system that is working together with that dominant culture embedded in it that is oppressing different groups of people. Black, Indigenous people of color, when we're talking about race, again, maybe oppressing women, maybe oppressing those who are not cisgendered, right? So those who are able-bodied, all of those preferences and privileges that we're talking about, they're inherent in all of those systems, right? When we walk out of our houses, we don't get to pick and choose. We have to drive or we have to walk, right? Our transportation, our modalities, we have to go into a grocery store. We have to consume food. We have to make sure that we are healthy and thriving, right? That we have our mask on, whatever it is, right? All of those, we don't get to pick and choose which institutions or structures we engage in, right? We all have to engage in multiple levels of structures and institutions, and together they make a system, which is the difference between structural and institutional racism, as well as systemic racism, which are all of those structures and institutions operating together to oppress groups of people.
Thank you. Bernadette, I'm going to go to you next. I'm going to ask you because I know you. But what would you say to somebody, let's say, if I look at you, I know that you graduated from a top university. I know that you have a master's from Georgetown. I know that you have worked for big, well-known institutions across this country. You're a National Urban Fellow. You're a business owner. What would you say to somebody who said, but aren't you living proof that maybe this structural racism or these concepts, it didn't impact you? How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that just because I made it to where I am does not mean that throughout the entire course of my life that I have not been affected and impacted by structural and institutional racism. I could start by the very nature of where I lived and where I grew up. I grew up in Camden, New Jersey, because New Jersey is an incredibly expensive state to live in. So my mother, being a widow at age 30 with 3 children, was only able to afford to live in Camden within the confines of South Jersey because everywhere else is incredibly expensive. And being in Camden, I knew from the jump, I knew at a young age that I was in a inferior school system in comparison to, say, Pennsauken, which was the township quite literally half a block and across the street away from my home. And so I grew up in an inferior school system. And I have a funny story. It's not funny, but it is funny, of when I wanted to take my PSATs in the 11th grade and I was a transfer student into my high school. I had, upon my mom's, her own anxiety about the school system I grew up in, she didn't want me to go to the local public high school that was just, 4 or 5 blocks up the street. And so I went to the vocational high school in Pennsauken, right, in order to get ahead, and realized that didn't work after 2 years, transfer into the local high school. And because paperwork, administration, yada, 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 I wasn't in the system, wasn't able to take the PSATs when they were being offered. And they were only being offered essentially by invitation to the kids that they thought were going to do well, because there wasn't enough space. There weren't enough slots for that. So when I had to go take my PSATs in Merchantville, which is the even more affluent town, 2 towns over, and I walked into their high school and it looked night and day comparison to my own high school, I know that race and racism was impacting sort of just the way in which my life operated. And so, yes, I have a master's degree from Georgetown. Yes, I have a business, but I also have a deep and seated and quite realistically a real fear that I will never overcome the cycle of poverty, because it's so hard to pull yourself out of poverty, even when you have money. I have income. I do not have wealth. I have Georgetown loans. I have University of Delaware loans. I own a home. I have a dog. I have a car. I don't have a partner. All of these things make it incredibly difficult for me to build wealth. I have an aging mother. I have Alzheimer's that runs in my family. All of these things will fall onto me and my siblings to take care of our mother should anything happen to her as she ages, which makes it incredibly difficult for me to build that individual wealth. All of that stems from the fact that we weren't able to build wealth generationally as a community for 40, 50 years because of federal policy. So even though I am where I am still not as far ahead or as comfortable as, say, a white counterpart who grew up in a maybe similar economic situation. Because even though I grew up in Camden, I didn't grow up poor. I just didn't grow up middle class. So to anyone who would think, yes, I've made it. Yes, I have. I've made it because I had the privilege of having a mother who said, come hell or high water, you will go to college. And incredibly different from even the family members within my own immediate family in terms of like her siblings. So I got privileged in having Linda as my mother. I got privileged in having that value of education instilled in me and being smart enough to just barely, to scratch through school with good grades without trying hard enough, but also living in a school system that didn't try to bring out the best of me and my classmates. And so I could be so much further ahead sometimes, I think, had it not been for the role of institutional and structural racism, where they put Camden, we didn't get enough school money in our school system. They purposefully put in place leaders and decision makers who were incompetent to ensure that there was consistent chaos within our school system. Because my mother was very active in our local government organization, or not organization, but she was active in the community and keeping abreast of what was going on. So I understood that. I understood that we were being cheated in the 6th grade with bad leadership in our school system. So imagine what would have happened to my potential had it been maximized by a school system for 12 years that invested in every bit of me, but they didn't. So I made it, but I could have gone further. I still have farther to go and I will get there. But the fact is, I have to still overcome these things. I have to overcome all manner of things that people will assume because they see a Black woman, particularly in the way that I look and present myself to the world. So to whomever may believe that, yes, you made it. I sure did. But I don't want it to also be a thing where you have to consistently overcome. That is what we're trying to do here. We're trying to eliminate the thing that you have to overcome, because if it's something that you have to overcome, the vast majority of people can't do it. And that's why we see the outcomes that we see right now. It's because not everybody can be exceptional. And we shouldn't assume that everybody has to be exceptional to just have a good life and not be worried about dying, in debt or dying alone, or like parent, what your parents how you're going to take care of your parents when they get older, so on and so forth.
I'm speechless. I'm just struck by your story and your strength, and I appreciate you sharing. Sharing. I want to go to two questions that came in from YouTube, and so I'm just going to pause. One is a comment, so anybody who wants to respond, let's go ahead and have you respond. The comment was, "Privilege is having something of economic value that can benefit something else. The poor, regardless of color, do not have privilege." I'm curious if anyone has thoughts or a response.
I will jump in real quick, and I want to piggyback off of what Sarah started with when she talked about privilege and white privilege in particular. And there are many different forms. I guess I should start by saying there are many different forms of privilege. And so there's white privilege, there's education privilege, there's geography privilege. Right now, I would say that where we live as people who live in the DMV, we are privileged to live in this region, regardless of how much money we have, because we have close access to airport, rail, bus lines, Uber, and high-speed internet, broadband. So even if you are poor as a church mouse, you have, in at least within reach, access to those resources versus someone who potentially lives in like Nacogdoches, Texas, right? Or Mississippi, I'm sorry, which is in the middle of quite literally the middle of nowhere. And their airport closes at 8 p.m. I know this why, because I have a funny story that I'm not going to talk about right now. But so when we talk about white privilege, the assumption of almost, let's talk about how we look at media. When politicians, CNN, the talking heads on cable news talk about the American political voter, the American voter, who do you envision? Do you envision someone like me, dark skin, blonde hair, purple lipstick? Or are you envisioning someone who looks like Sarah? That is white privilege. It's the assumption of whiteness being at the center of everything. And so again, you could be a poor white person don't have two pennies to rub together. But if you walk into a store as a white person, you may not be assumed to be stealing something versus Oprah walking into Hermes in Paris and refusing to be served. And everybody knows Oprah and everybody knows she's got more money than she knows what to do with. That is white privilege. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't get rid of it. You can use it because it assumes, you get this assumption of the benefit of the doubt, the assumption of normal, the assumption of belonging, right? Because white people make a majority of the population in this country. And so when people say Americans, they're more often than not, they are envisioning someone who looks like Sarah and versus someone who looks like me or Aaliyah or Jacqueline. That is, yes, you can be poor and you can still have privilege. You can have regional privilege, you can have educational privilege, you can have racial privilege, and you can have wealth privilege, right? If you're watching any of the Real Housewives, you see, right, the money privilege, the assumption of how they think that their lives are going to be because they live in this bubble of money, right? But even if they didn't have that money, they'd still be white and still be welcomed in other places, welcomed in certain places versus me. It's just the ability to blend in, to do whatever, to live your life without being noticed versus being sometimes hyper visible as a person of color, particularly when you walk into white spaces. So that's my 2 cents.
All right, I want to go to another question that we got from the chat. And Sarah, why don't we start with you on this one? But what happened to the idea of just being colorblind?
So I'm going to share a personal story that I think really speaks to this. So I have a 9-year-old son. He's a white male. And I had this idea that although he went to a school where there was some diversity, that I was not going to talk to him about issues of racism. And because I wanted him to be colorblind. And I mentioned that to one of my African-American friends. And he said to me, that's a privilege. To think that you can be colorblind is a privilege. He's like, I never got that with my kids. I had to talk. They came to me with it. He's like, before I ever even got around to talking, his son was in kindergarten and came home and said, someone said something about me negative because I'm African-American or my skin is black. And he said, I had to talk to my kids about racism way before, they should have been ready for that. They were just tiny little kids. And he said, and so you have to talk to your kids about racism. If you want to be an ally, if you care about an equitable society, you have to talk to your son about racism. And you have to tell him about it so that if he sees it, he can say something. He can speak up, because there are little kindergartner, African-American, Hispanic kindergartners in his class who are already hearing about it. And you don't want him to be one of those people who says something about race that's negative to those kids. And you also want him to speak up because he's white and he has privilege. And I was like, okay, got it. I mean, that experience was transformational. So being colorblind is a privilege. If you care about an equitable society, you will recognize that it is not a reality for all people.
Thank you. And the only thing I would add is, as I've thought about, when I've had friends who have said that, I don't see color, I don't see your color. As somebody on the other end, something that has bothered me with that is, as my friend, you're supposed to see me. You're supposed to see all of me and be excited to celebrate the full person that I am. And I am proud of my skin. I'm proud of the woman I am. I'm proud of what I look like. And so I've often thought about, we don't talk enough about, how we erase other people's identity by saying you don't see them or you don't see a piece of them. And I think that's also an important piece to talk about when we talk about being colorblind. Another comment that came in from the chat, and this would be for Bernadette or Jacqueline, and I apologize if I'm looking down, I just want to make sure I read it well. What about for people of color who say they don't see color or they don't want to talk about color? Can you speak to sort of why they might not want to address these issues, or why they might not want to talk about structural racism, or what it's like to be a person of their race or their skin color in this society?
I'm looking at Bernadette. I would say fear. And I think that there is a tendency to want to assimilate and be a part of dominant culture. In order to do that, like you said, we are erasing who we are in order to fit in and to make others feel comfortable. So I think that when we talk about race and we talk about racism, we also have to really talk about the nuances of race and racism, which are anti-Blackness, and colorism, which also exist in communities of color, right? So there is a universal anti-Black sentiment, meaning that the closer you are, the darker you are, the less likely you are to have privilege in the instance of colorism, and the closer you are in proximity and color to whiteness, even amongst communities of color, there is privilege. And so there is a tendency to want to erase our experiences and to erase our appearance and what we are in order to be closer in proximity or perceived proximity to whiteness. And that is at the hand of anti-Blackness universally.
All right, I have one more definition, and then I'm going to shift us to more of the politics of race and how we're doing in Alexandria. But this is another one that came in as we were planning for the panel. But the question is, what are microaggressions? And can you share an example? Whoever wants to start us on that one.
I'll start. So a microaggression is a statement, an action, or incident. It can be indirect, it can be subtle, it can be intentional or unintentional, but it's discrimination aimed at a group or a person that is in a marginalized community. So microaggressions don't just stop there. There are micro assaults, which are intentional verbal or nonverbal attacks meant to be discriminatory. And then there are micro invalidations. And those are meant to exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological impacts and effects that marginalized groups experience. And I think micro invalidations happen way more often and don't typically have a name. People are not familiar with micro invalidations, but it's something like saying, why is it always about race? Or they didn't really mean that when they said that. Or you're always talking about color. Or shouldn't we be in a colorblind society? that is a micro invalidation. It is the erasure of the experience of people of color in our culture and in our society. And so microaggressions appear, and I think Bernadette talked about macroaggressions. And I've seen a lot of literature just to say that they are just aggressions. They're not micro or macro, right? They are intentional. I think in the workplace, something that happens is gatekeeping or leaving people off of email chains, or going above them, or, changing their work after it's been submitted. Like, those are things that happen. And it's a behavior and a pattern of a culture where we say, your work doesn't completely matter, or what you say or how you feel about certain instances don't matter. And those are the kind of weathering that Black, Indigenous people of color experience on a day in and day out basis, just by virtue of us being in spaces that are not designed or meant to be for us, right? We have been integrating spaces, which is a good thing, but those spaces have not always welcomed us, and that inclusion we talked about earlier is not always there. And so we find ourselves often trying to assimilate when really we all should be trying to figure out how to celebrate our differences and create environments where we're all welcome.
Thank you. So I want to throw this out because a lot of the things we just talked about, the definitions you presented as matter of fact, this is what it is, what it is. So then if that's the case, why is race so politicized? Like, why, when we look at our public debate, does it sometimes seem like if you're on one side of the aisle, you care about these issues, and if you're on the other, you don't?
I guess I'll take a stab. I mean, when has race not been politicized? So I'll take us back to the 3/5 compromise or the Electoral College, right? These were all part of the, forgive me, I'm forgetting my history right now. But when the founders went and said, okay, we need to make some revisions to the Constitution, et cetera. We need to make some revisions to how we're going to operate this new land we call the United States of America, we the people, so on and so forth. And realizing, how do we divvy up power? How are we going to do voting? How are we going to count the votes when in the South, you've got 3 slaves for every white person, right? But we can't have those slaves voting, right? So, but the Southern states produce all this money because they have all this free labor and they're generating this money for our economy. So we make these compromises to ensure that they have power by dehumanizing the people who are already owned as property and being treated and working under the most brutal and inhumane conditions imaginable. And we wrote that into our political documents as our framing for how we're going to operate as a nation. So there has never been a moment when race wasn't politicized. We had to debate whether or not we're going to give the slaves freedom, right? And Abraham Lincoln lost his life, and he wasn't even that keen on Black folks. If you really read into him, it was like he sort of thought we weren't that smart and we were still kind of inferior, but it was the only way to save the Union, right? Was to like remove this inherent evil institution of slavery. So it's always been political. Now, in the end, also, we live in a society that we've been so deeply socialized, particularly white folks, to not talk about race. White folks are the only person on the planet who want to talk about being colorblind, which for me is hilarious, right? Because it's like, I know you mean it figuratively, but it's really just quite a silly concept to say, well, I'm not going to see color. So then will you not see, like, I guess we can say that for generations, white folks haven't seen Black people getting shot down like dogs by the police and treated like second-class citizens by their neighbors or themselves because we were colorblind. We've been socialized to be silent about race, and we've been socialized to treat it as the thing you don't talk about because it's impolite, as if we don't live in a society that's highly stratified and separated by race. There's a reason why when I got to University of Delaware, it was the first time in my life I went to school with white people in any sort of numbers, because my high school was entirely people of color. And there was one white girl, Dawn Miller. That's all I know, right? There's a reason why they asked me if they thought I had seen people get shot in Camden, because that's the only thing they knew about Camden from watching the news in the tri-state area of New Jersey and Delaware, right? It's always a political issue, and people are deeply uncomfortable about it because they never had to talk about it, because they've been taught not to speak about it. And so that's why it's a political issue. We can decide that it's not a political issue. We can decide it's a human issue, right? Because we're all connected as a society, as a community. We're connected to each other as human beings. And so we can decide to say, this isn't political. This is right and wrong. And I see that there are communities who are having incredibly different outcomes that live just blocks away from us, or a city or a town over, right? And that's not right. And so what do we need to do to make that not right? If that requires conversations that make you uncomfortable, then so be it. But because, again, Americans particularly have been socialized to not talk about it and never had that practice. And also we live in a society around this mythology of the greatness of America, as if its greatness wasn't derived from quite literally blood and bone of the Native American people, of Black enslaved Africans, and of the many people of color who came here to build our infrastructure and then were thrown away once they were finished doing that work. We had to decide that we're going to overcome this issue as a political issue and start looking at it as a human issue, because we can't say that we have these values of equality and love and blah, 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 blah. And then yet still Black people and Black and brown folks are dropping like flies during this pandemic because of these structural differences in the ways in which for generations we have been treated as second-class citizens. So we choose to make it a political issue, and we can choose to unpoliticize it and think about this in the grand scheme of things as us being shared as human beings with a shared existence who share this planet and have a shared interest in each other and how our lives operate. But right now, as Americans, as individualism, the rugged American individualists, we've been socialized to not do that. And so, of course, it's political.
So let's talk about how that shows up here and how we relate to one another right here in our city and what that looks like. And so, Sarah, I'm going to go to you because I know at Mind the Mat, you guys have made a statement that you are all in, for Black lives, that you are all in for equity, and that you want to be leaders in having this conversation. Why, as a business owner in the city of Alexandria, is that a statement or a principle that you would stand on and want to make a core piece of how you do business?
That is a good question. Thank you. So I think at the deepest level for me as a business owner, it's that I value fairness and I want to be a person of integrity. So that's kind of like the foundation. But I recognize that my business is an institution, right? And so if I care about fairness and I care about equity, I need to look at the institutionalized racism within my own within my own structure of my own business. And so that's one part of it. And what that means is to educate myself, number one. And then number two, to look at, or to be willing to kind of redefine and restructure my business and go through the policies and procedures with a fine-tooth comb. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. I am definitely, my business is in a work, and myself, we are a work in progress. So also, I think it's really important as a business person in Alexandria, if you do care about having an equitable community, I felt that I had to really own how much influence as a business I have on the fabric of our community, the wide-ranging influence. And then also, and so inevitably, my business is not only an economic institution, it's a social institution. It's an institution that is a gathering place, right? A place where people have conversation. And so what I put out there in my business affects the kind of society or kind of community we live in. And in addition, being a white woman business owner, I recognized as well that not only my business has this influence on our community, but as a white person, I have influence on this community. And so I need to look inside my institution and make sure that I'm in an integrity there, because that's going to filter out into what kind of community I live in. I would also say and I would include myself in having to really question myself around this, is a lot of really well-meaning business owners have said, I stand by people of color. use more pictures of people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in my marketing so that people feel welcomed into my business. And what I would say is that while it's well-intentioned, it's just not enough. And then the other piece of it is that people often do that for economic reasons, for economic gain. But what we really have to be doing is actually being an ally in those ways, standing by and saying, and yes, inviting people by using, more inclusive marketing. But we actually have to redefine what it is to be a business in Alexandria. And we have to not make the economic gain the main point. We have to make it a piece, because I'm not saying to bank business is willing to lose something as business people, whether it be economic, popularity, pieces of our business that we're attached to and that are ingrained because we've had them so long. We have to be willing to lose those pieces in order to create a society and community that is equitable. And so, having the bottom line be the most important thing is a white supremacist culture value. And so as business people, we really have to look at where does that fit in? How important is it? Yes, our businesses need to be viable, but what else are they about, right? In terms of creating this world, and what else is equally, if not more important? So that's kind of what I've learned as I've done these things.
Thank you, Sarah. Jacqueline, I want to go to you next, because you're also wrestling with kind of what's next for Alexandria in these conversations. And you recently worked on the All Alexandria Committing to Race and Social Equity resolution. And one of I think it's the first sentence, talks about that this resolution is needed because people of color continue to experience bias, discrimination, and unequal outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the unequal outcomes we're seeing in our city and what a resolution like this is designed to do?
Yeah, so as I previously mentioned, if we look at any indicator where we have data, if we have the data that's disaggregated by race, if we have data that's disaggregated by zip code, you're going to see that Black, Indigenous, people of color are doing much worse off. If we look at the life expectancy across the city, if you look north or south of Glebe Road, just that one road, like Bernadette is saying, just down the block, the life expectancy is 9 years different. So just by virtue of where I'm born in the city of Alexandria, it's predicted that I'll live nine years longer or 9 years less based on where I grow up. If we look at, again, educational attainment, if we look at poverty, if we look at who owns homes, which is a primary indicator of wealth, if we look at who's renting in our city, if we look at who's impacted closely by COVID-19, who's contracting COVID-19, who's dying from COVID-19, who's getting vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccinations, right? If we look at all of those indicators, we'll see again that Black, Indigenous, people of color are doing much worse off. This resolution is meant to acknowledge our past and be very honest about our past, right? Acknowledging the fact that 2 recorded lynchings happened in Alexandria, acknowledging that there were enslaved persons in Alexandria, right? Acknowledging that we had segregated accommodations in Alexandria, right? So acknowledging our history, being honest about it, acknowledging that Indigenous people lived on our riverfronts before any Europeans came to settle. So being very explicit about our history is one thing that the resolution sets out to do. The second thing is to acknowledge and celebrate our diversity, realizing that we have grown as a community, that we have tried, similarly to other cities across the country, to create spaces where people are equal or have opportunity or access, but that is not enough. We really have to focus on the outcomes. And again, that gets us to the equity part, right? So acknowledging that past in history, acknowledging where we have come short in our color blindness and our race neutrality, and really thinking strategically about how to use policy and practices, how to invite communities who have been left out of government, particularly government participation, government decision-making, inviting them into the conversation, and really changing how we do things, right? This is a community-based effort, and we have to make sure that we are hearing from people who are most impacted by the decisions that we're going to make. And that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, and also the other historically marginalized groups. There are ways and strategies that we can do that, and they are outlined in the resolution. Government has to be accountable to what we say we're going to do. So we have to have SMART goals, we have to have plans, we have to have transparency in doing this, and we have to have that honesty in relationship with community. That's not just about a public comment or a public engagement process, but every step of the way. There's a saying, nothing about us without us is for us, and that's how government needs to operate. If we're going to be a government for the people, by the people have the answer to what they need. We don't necessarily have the answer by virtue of how our institutions have typically operated, and we see that those disparities continue to exist. And so our primary goal is to work towards eliminating and reducing those disparities that are being experienced by communities of colors and other historically marginalized groups. So we're excited about the resolution. We're excited to codify that work, and we're excited to invite the community to participate with us. And I'll just say a lot of what has happened, or a lot of the conversations that we've had today in this forum, if you visit our website, alexandriava.gov/equity, we have a FAQ guide that answers the question about color blindness, or about what does Black Lives Matter mean, or why isn't this just about poverty? We have definitions and resources for you to engage with as a community. And the resolution will be annotated on our webpage. And so you'll be able to do that history and do that learning. It'll be a living and breathing document to provide you with resources as a community to continue to engage in this conversation, even beyond this forum tonight.
Thank you. Well, I'm getting a bunch of questions from the chat, so I want to bring some of those in as well. One, sort of starting with, and this one's about the resolution, but you talked about it's also meant to be a celebration. And in the city, we have over 150 different nations in Alexandria. We also have one of the most diverse city councils I think we've ever had. And so this question is asking, if we have this diversity, if we have elected officials of color, like, why do we need a piece of legislation or a resolution like this to address these issues? I guess it's saying we've made progress, so why?
Right. Just because we have it doesn't mean that we're in a position to celebrate or acknowledge what that means. And so we need to take a step further in celebrating first, and making sure that, again, people have what they need. If we have over 150 ethnic backgrounds in our city, what resources do we have for all 145 of those ethnic backgrounds? Is that something that we can say we can provide, or that they have access to? Are documents translated in all of those languages? And the short answer is no. So there is plenty of work for us to do to increase the belonging of those communities that are diverse in Alexandria. And so there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do in celebrating, and there's a lot of work to do in learning those communities and being in relationship and partnership and community together is really what we're trying to do, and to make sure that we fully understand who our neighbors are, because really that's what this is about. It's us being neighbors, and us, again, being good neighbors, right? Do we have that integrity and honesty when we want to be in relationship with people who are around us? And again, the outcomes show that across those diverse backgrounds, that they're not the same. We don't have the same access or the same opportunities, but again, the outcomes are also not in alignment with our white counterparts and peers. And so that is the goal, is to make sure that our solutions and our strategies reach those groups and are determined and dictated by those groups as well.
Thank you. Sarah, I want to go to you next. This one was a comment from YouTube, and the comment says, I believe white people are simply trying to be true to their interpretation of the MLK dream speech, not understanding that judging a person by their character is entirely different from celebrating culture. I'm just curious if you have any reactions or thoughts on that comment.
So just so I understand the comment, white people are being trying to be true to MLK's speech
Yes.
about.
So MLK's dream speech, and not understanding that judging a person by their character is different than maybe celebrating their culture. So I guess maybe a different way I can ask this might be, what would you say to somebody who says, they don't want to maybe engage or enter into these conversations because they're maybe trying to keep the peace or trying to not rock the boat or have a difficult conversation? And I apologize if that's not the interpretation the person meant, but if you send something else in the chat, we'll ask that again.
Okay, so it's about it's about keeping the peace to engage in conversations and create issues.
Yes.
I guess what I would say is that when we resist or deny or, avoid, problems grow larger in general. So, we can't be afraid of discomfort. We can't be afraid of conflict. What we need are to develop resources and tools to handle conflict and navigate conflict and disagreements and discomfort in a healthy way. So if we're avoiding the discomfort, if we're avoiding the hard conversations, it's most likely because we are not confident in our ability to sort of, in our skills at navigating those difficult conversations. And so I would say, work on those skills. Like what are the ways to communicate that are healthy and that can really handle discomfort? Because avoiding and, for the sake of peace, generally makes the problem just kind of fester and grow bigger.
Bernadette, I want to go to you on this next one. I'm going to do a little rapid fire so I can get in as many as possible. But can white people be the subject of microaggressions based on things like their religion, where they live, where they're employed, or who they associate with?
Yes. So I'm assuming that question is coming from sort of this place of probably understanding that racism is a one-way thing, right? So Black people cannot engage in the practice of racism in this country because racism is a system of oppression that requires like systemic power to oppress people. And so Black people can be bigots, right? Like people of color can be bigots and hold a lot of animosity and the same sort of like feelings of like dislike, inferiority, et cetera, towards white folks or other non-Black people or whomever's different, but not as a community of people be able to create a system that then says, like, let's talk about like the history of redlining, says that white people aren't able to get mortgages and buy homes. So that is like the practice of systemic institutional racism. So back to the original question, can white people be on the receiving end of microaggressions? Yes, because a microaggression is just that. It's an aggression. It's a way to sort of hurt someone or slight someone or invalidate someone. And that can be a two-way street. So yes, this is not to say that white people cannot be harmed by sort of these interpersonal interactions between people at the individual level, but on a systemic level, white people created the system of racism. And so they are the drivers and the beneficiaries of it at large. But they can still be on the receiving end and the painful receiving end of animosity, microaggressions, bigotry, prejudice, discrimination, and so on and so forth. But our society, our nation is not structured through our policies, through our processes, through our unspoken values that then discredits and devalues white people and dehumanizes white people as a group. And I wanna give a little maybe pushback isn't the right word, but just sort of a food for thought for whomever posited this question. And I really am glad that you asked that, because I do, as a Black person, as a Black woman, particularly, in my profession as a consultant in racial equity, see a pattern of what feels like desired victimhood on behalf of groups who have systemically benefited from oppressing other people. So white people feeling like they want to play victim or that they are being victimized. And that's not to say that you can't be hurt and attacked by these sort of things, but I just want to sort of make sure that you are aware, is this an opportunity? Is this a way for white people to feel victimized so that then they can absolve themselves from the accountability that all white people have to take accountability for the ways in which this nation operates? I just think that that's something to just be food for thought, like just to be aware of. But can you be on the receiving end? Of course. Can you be, especially like religion and I don't know, yeah, like religion, class, like that's a thing, right? We know that there's class warfare that cuts across all racial lines, especially particularly the haves and the have-nots. The haves like to look down on the have-nots, and it's no matter where you are, as long as you got somebody to look down on, it's possible to inflict that sort of hurt. Religion, people like can pick at that sort of like what you believe in and make fun of you, and so on and so forth. All of those things are possible, but from a structurally oppressive standpoint, white folks, except for when we're talking about like large scale, like capitalism being detrimental when it goes unchecked and unfettered, these social these social constructs, particularly around race, it's when we're talking about systems and writ large, whom holds the power and how that power is used to leverage and separate people from their money, separate people from their families, and just sort of dehumanize and devalue at writ large. It's a one-way street.
Jacqueline, I want to go to you next because your head was nodding in every different direction. So I'm just curious if you have any comments or things that you want to add to what Bernadette said.
I don't even remember the question, but when she started talking about playing victim and that being the impetus that lacks accountability for engaging in the conversation, I was like, yes, right. And it paralyzes those individuals who want to claim that, right? There has to be accountability to move this conversation forward. What we're seeing now is that, the issues of racism are not an issue for Black people, Indigenous people, people of color. It's a white issue, right? You all created this system of oppression. And it's up to you all to ultimately say that we can't stand for this anymore, right? That takes what Sarah alluded to earlier is self-awareness, right? And that self-awareness, as James Baldwin would say, is something that white people don't want to remove or take away because then they'll be left with nothing, right? So it's that depth of really knowing who you are and knowing that your whole identity is set up on these principles and ideologies that everybody else is inferior to you, right? And so we have to be able to take and strip that off, deal with what's there, and then that's really how we grow and have that accountability. But that universal victimhood is really what's holding up, and that lack of self-awareness is really what's holding a lot of this back.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really great point, because some of the comments I had seen or people had talked about with the resolution is you talk about in there, white supremacy culture and white supremacy culture being dominant. And there were people who sent us, emails and said, what do you do if, as a white person, you feel attacked by that language? And I think you guys have each covered this in a different way, from Sarah talking about owning the emotions that come up for you when that happens, to understanding the history of what that means in terms of not it being an attack that you, person who's reading this, white person who's reading this, is racist, but what are we understanding about the structures of racism and culture within our community? I'm going to go really quick because there are so many pouring in. So if you can give me like quick answers, whoever can take them, and then I'm going to move us to where do we go from here. So one is around how do we tie this conversation about race specifically into what can we do to improve education in our city, and what can we do to increase home ownership among the Black community?
Go ahead, Bernadette.
Okay, so I guess at the surface level, to answer this question, invest, like, here's a radical idea. Let's maybe not tie the quality of your schools based on the tax base of the city, because then you've built inequality into the system inherently. So more investment in schools, and not just like money, but also like the wraparound support systems, right? Because pouring money into like spending X number of dollars per student in a poor school district, where still every kid is coming from an impoverished home, and all of sort of the challenges that can come with that, you're just pushing the problems onto like with teachers. And I speak of this very personally. My younger sister is a kindergarten teacher in North Philly. And she's been a teacher for about 6 or 7 years. So she's seen it all. And it's literally like the scapegoating into the schools is the problem, is that there's no focus in creating the sort of wraparound supports for people who have challenging social structures in their home, right? So if your parents are working all the time, or you get an unstable home or whatever, it doesn't matter if the school system is spending $800 per student or whatever. If you're coming to school exhausted, you're coming to school hungry, you're coming to school to teachers that don't care about you, teachers that do not look like you, and a school system that devalues you by assuming that you're barely going to, they're expecting the bare minimum from you, then all that money won't be worth much. And so when I say invest, I'm not just talking about dollars. I'm talking about human, social, and emotional investment in these places. And to the point of home ownership, give us the damn money. It's just really like, give Black people money to make down payments and be able to cover their mortgage. Because when the housing crisis hit in 2008, it was Black folks that got hit the hardest. They were starting to get these home ownership rates. They were coming up, right? Because they were being targeted for predatory mortgages. And then they couldn't afford it, right? Because also we lack the wealth. We don't have the cushion, to fall back on family, because we are the family who's taking care of family. And so if you want Black folks to own homes, you got to make sure that they have enough capital, not only to buy the home, but to pay the mortgage, and then have money to pay for things when things go wrong, right? Because that's how home ownership gets dicey. And so creating some really significant and comprehensive like financial supports and access to like grant dollars for people of color who don't have wealth, right? Because I could see how this could, completely devolve politically into you're giving Black people free money. So then make it about do you have wealth and not just income, and really target it from this systemic place, so that you're really addressing the problem at its root, instead of slapping a Band-Aid on it and then expecting people to be able to build wealth when they can't really afford the mortgages that they have, or they're house poor, So that's on the surface. But then below that is really, again, the comprehensive supports, and understanding that I own a home and I got 3 degrees and I'm still worried about dying in a cycle of poverty. So like recognizing that education and home ownership are actually not just the answers, particularly for communities who have been disinvested and prevented from accessing wealth that creates the stability that you can pass on to your children when you die. And we don't have that in communities of color writ large. We just don't.
And I want to go back to something too that was said earlier that I think ties into what you talked about. But I think it was Jacqueline, you talked about the need to have data and disaggregate it. I think a lot of times when we do a home ownership program or we do an education initiative, it's framed for all, which is important because we want all people to do well and thrive. But when we look at where the outcomes are and the disparities in those outcomes, I think we have to be willing then to figure out how do we look at the data and see who has the most need, and being able to target programs and resources to that. Really being intentional in what's the problem we're trying to solve, what success we're trying to get to, where are people starting at, and then how do we invest in different ways, like you said, from every piece of the system, from education to home ownership to transportation and some of the other areas we talked about. Sarah, I want to ask this question to you, and then, like I said, we'll start to wrap up. But there was a question about what can local civic groups or businesses or folks do to engage with the African American community in Alexandria, or to engage with communities that maybe they've never worked with before?
That's a great question. I think the first step is to find out from those communities what they need. And I am learning a lot about the concept of mutual aid right now. And so it's first learning about what they need, instead of starting from like more of a top-down like philanthropy approach. It's like going into the community, finding out what they need, and then similar to what Bernadette was talking about, perhaps giving them the resources, having a certain number of your services be part of a mutual aid program, or giving a lot of practitioners will do like staggered pricing based on what people can afford. And so I think that's just a really good basic place to start. And just in terms of my services, I've been doing some mutual aid services where I donate a certain amount of my services to mutual aid for people who need it. And I think, could grow, the business community here could grow more mutual aid systems in our community that could really help people who need it. Yeah, and I'm up for spearheading that. So
Yes. Bernadette or Jacqueline, any thoughts on that question? If not, I'll go to my next ones.
Go to the community, go to where they're at. So I know that's really hard right now in COVID times, and that's really unfortunate. But part of like how to engage communities of color is go to their events, like get to like and listen. Like we live in such silos, such racial and social silos, and we don't even realize it. Where it's like, and really practice active listening. So I think part of like understanding about what people need is also listening to these sort of discussions. And I know that they're going on in so many different venues and in different ways, but really listening to what's being said and listen past the anger. Cause yes, it'll be uncomfortable and people are mad and we get to be mad because, a January 6th could have gone really, really differently, or had it gone differently, or had November 3rd gone differently, we'd be living in a very different world in which I would be cussing left and right about now with absolutely no apology. And I almost feel like I have the permission to anyway, because we got a Black vice president, but that's neither here nor there. Go to where the community is and really listen to what's being said and what's not being said. You got to really practice that active listening between the lines. And then when you start to feel uncomfortable, particularly if you're a white person, examine why. What exactly is making you uncomfortable? Because sometimes I get a little exasperated with the fear of this discomfort. And like, if you've had children and you have husbands and wives and run businesses and have like engineering degrees, and you're not uncomfortable with doing hard things, right? Like I'm afraid of having children. I think it's like the worst decision I could ever make because I'm terrified of it. And so if you're going into that, like these racial conversations with that sort of fear, you need to understand what that's rooted in, and then how do you start to acclimate yourself to that? Because the whole thing of being uncomfortable is not that you stay in that uncomfortable, is that you push past it. You can progress through it so that this is no longer uncomfortable. I can talk about race all day, every day with any person and speak very plainly about it because I've had practice, and that's what it's about. So then going to those communities, right? Like, oh my God, I'll be the only white person there. Well, guess what? Black folks do that all the time. You'll get over it if you keep doing it over and over again. So you can really understand and hear what people need by what they're saying, by what they're asking for, what they're mad about, what they're sad about, all of that. So that's my spiel.
No, and I think the listening piece is so important, because too often what happens is these conversations is it's okay, well, I heard what Bernadette said, and so I need to take that, and that is the fact for every single conversation that I have with another Black person. And I will say, even when we posted about this event, there were people commented. There was an article in the Alexandria Times, and where the person who wrote the opinion piece, they talked about that they find that messages like end racism or Black Lives Matter may have harmful or hateful subliminal messaging, and that it can instill in Black children self-pity, doubt, and skepticism. I think it's important to recognize, as we started from the very beginning, each of us has a different story. Each of us has a different perspective. Each of us has a history that we bring to this. And part of having these conversations is being willing to ask the question of, how does this feel to you? How do you feel in this moment? What can I do differently? If someone says that they felt offended, it's not rushing to, oh, you're too sensitive, or that couldn't be because I've never seen that happen. It is really sitting with, I may not get it, but let me seek to understand. Because if we don't have that willingness to listen and understand, or to go where people are having the conversation, or to go where the issues are, then we're never going to do more than just have, more sessions like this on Monday nights. So I do want to pivot, because a lot of times when we have these conversations, people rush to, then what can I do? And that sometimes scares me, because then I think it goes to read this book, do this checklist, do this thing. And we're not going to stop. These issues took, what, you said 400 years to get here, if not before that. They're going to take a long time to solve, and they're going to take more forums, more working together, more listening. But I do think, though, there are maybe something, like one small thing that someone could do leaving here. There's maybe one thing you might be doing, or one thing you'd want people to reflect on as they leave the conversation. And so I want to just kind of do a round robin, and I'll ask each of you to share maybe what's one question you would leave people to think, that you would want people to think about as they leave this conversation. And I'm going to start with Jacqueline.
As I'm thinking. I appreciate the conversation. So thank you so much for moderating, and thank you for everybody who has participated. I keep in my mind, we talked a lot about white dominant culture and about white supremacy and what that means. And I just want to make it very clear for everybody out there, especially considering the questions that we had, that white people are not the problem. Whiteness is the problem, right? Whiteness, the ideology and benefit that comes with the buying into whiteness, that is the problem. And so if I had to challenge anybody, I would say learn about whiteness and really what that means and the nuances thereof of whiteness. The book is, and again, you have to read. So in addition to being in community with people, you have to read and learn and listen. There are lots of podcasts and all of that out there, but Becoming White, because historically the way our country is set up, whiteness wasn't always a privilege given to white people. Prior to the 50s and 60s, you were Irish or you were Polish or you were Italian, and you were treated differently based on those ideologies. And then we emerged into this kind of super whiteness that is oppressing everybody, right? And so learning about what whiteness means and how that shows up for you, and really sitting with it, and then thinking about what you can do to learn if communities of colors will have you, and be in community with them, in hopes to become an ally. I'll just say that. So again, thank you for having us. And I'll just say, keep learning. You have to be uncomfortable. You can't grow without discomfort.
All right, Bernadette, I'm coming to you next.
Okay. So I don't have a question. I have a directive, and it is, as I'm thinking about Alexandria and HQ2, Amazon that's coming, that, a lot of people, myself included, are quite nervous about what that's going to do for their housing stability, right? Because it's already expensive to live in the DMV, and it's going to get more expensive if HQ2 plays out in the way in which we are afraid of. And so my directive is to fight like hell, as if it's your child or your life is on the line, for any of these, the things that make emerge from HQ2, that communities are screaming about, that this is going to be detrimental to them. Get involved in sort of the policy and advocating for fight like hell to make sure that doesn't happen. New York did it. New York fought like hell, and they didn't get HQ2. And we didn't fight like hell in this area. It's hard, right? DMV is transient. So put yourself in the place of, I'm a single mom with 2 kids, and the average rent in this place for a 2-bedroom apartment is over $2,000, and I don't make that sort of money. What in God's name am I going to do when the price of housing goes up another 25% in the next 2 years? What are those things? How are we going to prevent that? So that's my directive. And like Jacqueline said, read and learn and listen. Plethora of books, podcasts, any which way you name it. Don't go on YouTube, because the algorithm is going to mess you up, and then you'll be in QAnon place before you know it. But the podcast, start there.
It's Sarah.
All right, I'll make this short because I know we have to end. So I would definitely second everything that Jacqueline and Bernadette said. And one thought that I had is for, people, for white folks, when you find yourself feeling defensive or, offended, know that none of us are going to really know truly who we are and feel truly empowered when we take away, until we take away, white privilege and structural racism. So ultimately, at the root of this all, there's a huge gift for all of us. And I know there's a lot of fear about that, a fear about giving up privilege and handing over power and having things be more equitable. But when we do that, we will really understand who we are more fully.
Well, I appreciate each of you sharing your story, answering these questions, just giving us your time and your perspective. As we started, this is about a learning journey. And I think in your directives, you also challenged us with the question of what can each of us do to keep learning, to keep growing, to become uncomfortable. And so I hope that this is the first of many conversations. I would also challenge us, as you engage in other dialogues, whether it's about our budget or economic development or transportation or any of the other systems we've had here, be thinking about how issues of race, diversity, equity, and inclusion show up, or how they haven't shown up and maybe need to be brought into that conversation. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your brilliance. And with that, we are going to prepare to close the program. Thanks for joining us this evening.